Hey everybody, welcome back. With this video, we're going to start talking about Paul Tillich's Dynamics of Faith. I have an older version that looks like this. You might have a newer version that looks like this. Same book, slightly different pagination. Let me just say that Paul Tillich's really influential Christian theologian of the 20th century. He is someone who works at the intersection, or he worked at the intersection of existential philosophy and Christian theology and philosophy of religion. He raises, really important questions. He's really interested. He also wrote a really influential systematic philosophy, systematic theology. So for you folks that are interested in that kind of stuff, it's definitely worth checking out. He basically is interested in this idea of correlation. There's probably a lot of stuff that we could say is, here's what's going on with him, but one thing that really stands out is this idea of correlation, and that is, religion sort of has an ongoing task to correlate itself to what's going on in the world, what's going on, particularly within a culture. In some ways, it kind of explains like why religion changes. We might still say we might be a part of a religion or a faith community that like says words, like from a creedal statement or read from a book that are centuries old, thousands of years maybe. And, the difference is things like we're probably not reading it or speaking it or hearing it in the language in which it was written, right? Like it's correlated, it's translated to our language, right? Or at least to a language that we can understand. Perhaps it also means something like when what we hear is something that's going to be filtered through, the biases that we have inherited, the assumptions that we've inherited, the view of the world, the understanding of the world that we've inherited, that we've become accustomed to. And so you take a passage out of a religious text and it's being presented to a particular audience, say centuries ago, say 2,000 years ago, whatever the case might be. And then you take those same passages and you bring it, it travels that long distance, to the 21st century. And we probably don't hear the same things. We don't hear ideas the same way. We don't understand the power relationships the same way. Our sort of view of the world is very different, and our view of the selves as political agents, as economic agents, as whatever the case might be. And we've talked about some of that throughout this course. And this is all to say that for Tillich, like a lot of the people that we've read, not all of them, but for a lot of the people that we've read, how can we keep religious life meaningful? And part of that's asking like what it means, what it signifies. With the last reading with Berger, we have that. Like what's really going on, and then the reading that we're going to do after this is going to do the same thing. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is he gives us a sort of existential understanding of religion, faith, such that we can bring our own content to it, or each religion perhaps fills it in with its own particular content, but the basic structure is one that, I would argue makes the case that everybody's religious. Even rejecting particular religious tenets or particular religious, particular religions, particular assertions of faith that a community might make or tradition might make. That from an existential point of view, the way that human beings are put together, that there is still a way to think about that in terms of faith, that basically it kind of brings us together, and not necessarily in a warm and fuzzy way, but in a way that speaks to what it is that human beings really need, and how it is that they go about trying to fulfill those needs, and that certain things do it really well and certain things don't. So that's a little bit of background about the text, some of my own ideas about what's going on with Tillich. I'll try to let the text speak for itself, from here. So let's go ahead and look at chapter 1, which is primarily what we're looking at for the purposes of this course. I might jump into chapter 3 when we are done, because there's some things that he says about symbols that I think would be really helpful. Okay, so chapter 1, what faith is, reading right from the beginning. He says, faith is the state of being ultimately concerned. So if you want to know what Tillich's definition of religion is, it is the state of being ultimately concerned. And at first you might, like, okay, whatever. You probably just need to think about that a little bit. Ultimate concern, not like kind of concern, not concern, not like worry. It's concern coming out of, this existential phenomenological tradition, primarily Heidegger, in which we understand the human being as like we locate the center of the being in something like care, right? And so with that means that we can look at all the different aspects of the human being's emotional, attitudinal relation to the world and everything they're doing from this centered position of I care about my own existence. I have concern regarding my own existence, and this is what carries me off into the various states that I find myself. And of all of the different concerns that I have, again, positively or negatively, the concerns that are happy concerns that are of a positive nature, or the negative concerns like I worry or I have fear, like whatever they are, it's you experience those things because you care. He's saying of all of those, the ultimate concern, right, is what touches on religious life, faith, right? So what is faith? What is religion? It's the state of being ultimately concerned. Drop down a few lines. He says, if it claims ultimacy, well, let me back up a little bit. He says the dynamics of faith, the activity, the movements, the happening of faith, are the dynamics of man's ultimate concern. Man, like every living being, is concerned about many things, above all about those which condition his very existence, such as food or shelter. You care about having food or shelter, right? You need those things to live. He says, but man, in contrast to other living beings, has spiritual concerns. What are spiritual concerns? Cognitive, aesthetic, social, political. We care about beauty. We care about our political organization, how we organize ourselves. We care about our social relationships. We care about all of these sort of they don't speak to like oxygen and food and water and protection from the elements. I mean, they can touch on those things, but those are sort of those basic creaturely needs. But these other sense of particularly human needs, not just creaturely needs, they're of a spiritual nature because they get at aspects of human life within the individual, within us collectively, um, that we need these things for the greater sense of meaning, connection, purpose, fulfillment, all that kind of stuff. That it's really getting at notions of like truth and beauty, right? Of a maybe a sane existence, something like that, a dignified existence. He says some of them are urgent, often extremely urgent, talking about these concerns. And each of them, as well as the vital concerns, can claim ultimacy for a human life or the life of a social group. If it claims ultimacy, it demands the total surrender of him who accepts this claim, and it promises total fulfillment, even if all other claims have to be subjected to it or rejected in its name. So he just did those last couple of things that I read there. He's listing two aspects of this sort of, three-part, equation, if you will, of understanding what it means to say that faith or religion is the state of being ultimately concerned. Like, well, how do you know that it's ultimate concern? Like, what takes it from being a concern or a really important concern to being the ultimate, right, concern? And what he says here is that it demands total surrender of him who accepts the claim. So what, you could ask yourself, what is it in your life that demands, total surrender, right? That this thing, whatever it is, that is making this, that makes a claim upon it. Because lots of things make claims upon your life, taxes makes claims upon your life. Homework makes claims upon your life. Your friends asking you to do stuff makes claims upon your life. Like, there's all sorts of that kind of stuff. But what is it that has, like, is the ultimate of those claims that demands your total surrender at any given time, right? And then he says it promises total fulfillment, even if all of the claims have to be subjected to it or rejected in its name. So, like, it claims, it has the claim upon you of total surrender, but in exchange for that, it promises, like, you haven't yet experienced it, right? But it promises total fulfillment, right? It's going to be that whatever that rounds out your life and brings it into its ultimate fulfillment, of sublimity, of joy, of peace, like whatever, right? And the third part that he goes on to talk about is that it threatens utter destruction. So this is the three things that ultimate concern does. Is it demands total surrender, it threatens your utter destruction, and it promises your ultimate fulfillment. And so it's got this demand, threaten, promise structure, right? Because if it didn't, and by saying that it threatens utter destruction, I mean, this basically means, like, if it doesn't work out, like if it's wrong, or if the project fails, whatever it might mean. But you can kind of look at those three things and sort of start to evaluate for yourself, what your ultimate concern is. Because a lot of people, I think, if they're really honest, might have assumed that A, B, or C was like the thing in their life. But if they get real honest about asking these questions, they could maybe like find out like what indeed is their ultimate concern. What is their God? What is their religion? And you can start to see now how this sort of existential analysis and structure is one in which we just have to be really honest about ourselves about what's actually the content of these things. And in this sense, everybody has an ultimate concern. Everybody's religious in this sense. He says the extreme. He says right where we left off. He says if a national group makes the life and growth of the nation its ultimate concern, it demands that all other concerns, economic well-being, health and life, family, aesthetic, cognitive truth, justice, and humanity, be sacrificed. Right. So for example, you could talk about you could talk about the nation. You could have this zealous form of nationalism in which a nation, a country becomes someone's ultimate concern, right? And I think that you've probably seen this. Maybe some of you feel this way, in which this isn't just a sort of mild patriotism. It's not like appreciating where you come from and respecting where you come from. This is the most important thing in my life is the prestige, the dominance, the prosperity of this national group of which I'm a part, in which I find my identity. Right? He says the extreme nationalism of our century. So again, he's talking about the 20th century, but I think that's carrying on into today. Of our century are laboratories for the study of what ultimate concern means in all aspects of human existence, including the smallest concern of one's daily life. Everything is centered in the only God, the nation. A God who certainly proves to be a demon, but who shows clearly the unconditional character of an ultimate concern. I mean, this is him saying, there's not a lot of rules in terms of what can be an ultimate concern, but we could certainly demonstrate that some of them tend not to work out, and that they generally prove disastrous. Ultimately, because they can't make good on the promise, that they can't deliver on those spiritual concerns that we have, the cognitive, aesthetic, social, and political, and whatever else we might add to that. Which is not to say that I mean, so don't mishear this. This isn't saying that nations are wrong or anything like that, but that a zealous form of nationalism shows for us just how an ultimate concern works. Like that can fill in the content for us with this structure. However, it doesn't deliver. It can certainly destroy us. It can certainly make these, it can demand everything from us, and it can make promises, and it can certainly destroy us, it can threaten us. But its ability to deliver on those promises in any sort of either meaningful or even quantitative sense, perhaps. It's not able to do that. When we look at crime statistics, or we look at social division, or we look at poverty, right? Whatever the case might be, declining literacy, like the nation. Whether we're talking about America or we're talking about some other place, like there's not like a perfect place that can act, that can fulfill this ultimate concern. Again, formally it can do it, structurally it can do it, but it doesn't do it in the way that Tillich's going to say that religious life, in some ways, in the traditional sense, is able to do. Okay, let's see. So let's go. A lot of this is really good. I want to, try to keep moving along through here. Let's go to the last couple of paragraphs of the first section of chapter 1. He says, another example, almost a counterexample, yet nevertheless equally revealing, is the ultimate concern with success, right? So we're talking about business, we're talking about economic concerns, we're talking about the rat race, we're talking about people who give themselves over to that's why he puts it in scare quotes, right? Success, right? And I think that a lot of people know what he's talking about. Ultimate concern with success and with social standing and economic power. It is the god of many people in the highly competitive Western culture, and it does what every ultimate concern must do. It demands unconditional surrender to its laws, even if the price is the sacrifice of genuine human relations, personal conviction, and creative eros. Its threat is social and economic defeat, and its promise, indefinite as all such promises are, the fulfillment of one's being. It is the breakdown of this kind of faith which characterizes and makes religiously important most contemporary literature. So he's talking about like, novels and plays and that kind of stuff that are honing in on the like providing a sort of a portrait of life, the life of the times. And so they're starting to look at people who have given themselves over to this, and what happens to domestic life, and what happens to family life, and what happens to the spiritual life of a person, right? And we still have those stories. We're still telling those stories. He says, no, not false calculations, but a misplaced faith is revealed in novels like Point of No Return. When fulfilled, the promise of this faith proves to be empty. Like, you can make that money, right? It might work out for you in that regard, but its ability to fulfill the promises of an ultimate concern of those spiritual dimensions of life that it can't do, and it never has been able to do, right? And this is part of what makes it, like the zealous nationalism, problematic, right? It makes it more, demonic in that sense. He says, faith is the state of being ultimately concerned. The content matters infinitely for the life of the believer, but it does not matter for the formal definition of faith. Like I said, you can take other things and sort of plug it into the content, to plug it into this dynamic structure. It can make the demand, it can make the promise, it can make the threat, but that not all of them are able to, carry through with it, at least in the positive sense. He says, and this is the first step we have to make in order to understand the dynamics of faith, right? So, understand that structure, understand that basic definition, understand that structure, understand that you can plug many things into it, but that he wants to build towards, perhaps something a little bit more constructive, and that is to say, like, what is a preferable or legitimate form of content for this dynamic structure. So in the second section, again, still in chapter 1, he writes, it's titled "Faith as a Centered Act." He says, faith as ultimate concern is an act of the total personality. And that's important, because this means that it's not supposed to be just like a mental assent. It's not just supposed to be like, well, here's my life and I live it this way, and here's my day-to-day affairs. I go here, I do this, and I behave this way, But like there's like this space in my heart, or there's like this aspect of my mind where like that's where my ultimate concern. That's like the real stuff, I believe, right? And he's like, no, like if we want to really understand what ultimate concern is for you, we're taking the total personality, we're taking the total human. Otherwise it's not ultimate for you. It's something contextualized. It's something compartmentalized. What is it that arrests you, grabs hold of you in your totality of who you are? He says, faith is the most centered act of the human mind, right? So it includes all of you, and it speaks from the heart of that total picture of you, that total portrait of you. He says it's not a movement of a special section or a special function of man's total being. They're all united in the act of faith. So it takes all of it together, brings it together, and then speaks, from the center of that place. Drop down to the bottom of the next paragraph. He says, for faith is a matter of freedom. Freedom is nothing more than the possibility of centered personal acts. That's a bold claim, but it's intriguing. That, like, if you really want to know freedom in the existential sense of freedom, then it's your ability to act, from this centered place of your total person, right? That it's not just restricted to particular aspects in which you're like holding this in reserve, or only acting upon this which competes with this. But it is a representation of the total person which you are, and again speaking from the heart of that person which you are. That's real freedom. Um, the frequent discussion in which faith and freedom are contrasted could be helped by the insight that faith is a free, namely a centered act of the personality. In this respect, freedom and faith are identical. I mean, which I think is really lovely. A lot of times people associate with faith, um, you know, what it is that people can't do, what restricted behaviors. Um, and for Tillich, it's much rather freedom to act from who you really are, in the totality of who you are. And so the idea of faith and freedom being identical, again, I think it's an exquisite existential portrait of the human being that really opens it up for people to rediscover, who they are and what really matters for them, and perhaps even to rediscover the possibilities of religious life, of participation in faith communities, so on and so forth. Let's see here. Let's go to jump 1, 2, 3. Jump ahead 4 paragraphs. And in the middle of that fourth paragraph, Tillich writes, "At this point, it must be stated as sharply and insistently as possible that in every act of faith there is cognitive affirmation, not as a result of an independent process of inquiry, but as an inseparable element in a total act of acceptance and surrender." Again, when we're thinking about ultimate concern. He says, this also includes the idea that faith is the result of an independent act, excludes this idea, that the idea that faith is the result of an independent act of a will to believe. He goes on to say that faith is not a creation of the will, that it's not an emotional outburst, that it's not the meaning of ecstasy. He's taking all these different sort of approaches that people have had. It's just like, well, I'm just going to will to believe it, or I'm going to give myself over to this emotional, maybe quasi-mystical experience that I'm having. Perhaps it's from prayer and meditation, or it's from corporate worship, or whatever the feeling or sensation might be, the ecstatic of it, the ecstatic experience. That it is, it's not that. That, again, we're talking about the total person, everything coming together, speaking from the center of that place in a free act. It's not restricted to a pure act of consciousness or will. It's not the recitation of a creed in which we mentally affirm things that we don't fully understand. And it's not. I would even say that it's not that those aren't things that human beings do, and it's not things that certain forms of religion haven't asked people to do. It's rather that that's not really the essence of what religion is. That's not what faith as ultimate concern is. So we need to make sure that we get that. Okay, let's go. Let's go to the third section, the source of faith. What's the source of faith? He says, we've described the act of faith in its relation to the dynamics of personality. Faith, and if you can't hear it, I mean, so what's here is not only traditional theological, language and procedures, but it's now happening by way of an existential approach, existential phenomenology. There's Heidegger's ontology is here. Freud is here. What's been going on in sociology, developments, and arts and letters, cultural portraits of human life, and this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of correlation. Like it's the task of the theologian to or the scholar of religion, perhaps. But Tillich, as a theologian, he's much more of an advocate. In that it's their task to sort of correlate developments and where we're at with faith, with religious phenomena, religious life. It's not something like, here's this thing that happened, and it is what it is, and we just pretend as though it travels in its own sort of like protective vault up into the present, and we just sort of get it that way. Like, no, I mean, that's not how that works. Like, there's centuries, millennia, in which things have happened that impact who and what we are as interpreters, as aware human beings in the world whose emotions are impacted in particular ways that are different, because of our language, because of our culture, because of the way that we look, because of our class. All that stuff and more. It changes, how it is that we relate to religion, and that's kind of what he feels, is a large part of his task, is to show us that the changes, show us the differences that we need to be aware of, theoretical ones, psychological ones, sociological ones, artistic ones, that we need to be made aware of, so that it's relevant, that it's real, that it's authentic, that it's not a game that we're playing with ourselves. Ergo, it's not some mental assent that's like a denial of the life that we're actually leading. Okay, he says faith is a total and centered act of the personal self, the act of the conditional, infinite and ultimate concern. The question now arises, what is the source of this all-embracing, all-transcending concern? What's the source of it? He says the word concern points to the two sides of a relationship, the relation between the one who is concerned and is concerned, the who and the what, the subject and the object, right? Dropping down a couple lines, he says, man's experiences, feelings, thoughts are conditioned and they're finite. You only have, you are a finite mortal who has the perspective of a finite mortal. You don't know what it's like to be people from different times and different places. You have an imagination, and that's really helpful, but that you don't have a universal, infinite perspective on things, right? You have your perspective, and that this is important as part of this, understanding of the source of religious life, of faith, because who is it? Because you're on one end of the equation, right? There's you, and there's whatever it is that is your ultimate concern. And so you need to be honest about who you are and what your limitations are. Otherwise, the equation will be off. And you have to be honest about the other as well, right? The object of this thing. He says, they not only come and go, but their content is of finite and conditional concern unless they are elevated to unconditional validity. But this presupposes the general possibility of doing so. It presupposes the element of infinity in man. Man is able to understand in an immediate, personal, and central act the meaning of the ultimate, the unconditional, the absolute, the infinite. This alone makes faith a human potentiality. Let me go on a little bit here. He says, I'm going to skip a paragraph. The unconditional concern, which is faith, is the concern about the unconditional, the infinite passion, as faith has been described as the passion for the infinite. To use our first term, the ultimate concern is concern about what is experienced as ultimate. In this way, we have turned from the subjective meaning of faith as a centered act of the personality to its objective meaning, to what is meant in the act of faith. Just a little bit more. He says, it would not help at this point of our analysis to call that which is meant in the act of faith God or a God, for at this step we ask, what in the idea of God constitutes divinity? The answer is, it is the element of the unconditional and of ultimacy. So I guess what I want to get at here, I want you to get, is in our finitude, our limitedness, we long for certain things. And what we long for educates us about ourselves, or should. But it also tells us what we're trying to locate in the object of our faith. Again, whatever that is. And he says, well, like, okay, what if we just say, hey, it's God, right? And he wants to say, okay, all right, what in the idea of God constitutes divinity? What makes it the worthy object of ultimate concern and of faith, of religious life? It's the element of the unconditional and of ultimacy. This carries the quality of divinity. I mean, another way of saying the idea of God represents for us what it is that we're longing for out of our mortal and finite condition. That our passions, desires, our emotional life, that for which we long, is, almost necessarily, if not necessarily, what it is that we don't have. Like one of the ways that Plato talks about love is, we love what we don't have, right? And a lot of people are like, what? It's a desire for something, and he points out the sort of, what should be obvious. You wouldn't desire it if you already had it, right? You can only desire what it is that you don't have, or that you don't essentially have. And so in that sense, there are these qualities, where we might use words like ultimate and infinite, stuff like that, that then God represents or symbolizes for us. And that is why God becomes the sort of worthy object, divine, in relation to our mortal condition. That's why we want to worship God. That's why we want to, talk in these big terms, in these ultimate terms. That's how God enters into the equation there. Just a little bit more. Let's go skip a paragraph. He says, in terms like ultimate, unconditional, infinite, absolute, the difference between subjectivity and objectivity is overcome, right? So think of subject-object relationships. I'm a subject. The world is filled with objects. We can problematize that later. But that's the basic idea. Like, here, I'm a subject. Here's my Batman coffee mug. It's an object. I can hold it. I can perceive it. I can, think thoughts about it. And what does he want to say here? When we're using terms like ultimate, unconditional, infinite, absolute, the difference between the subject and the object is overcome. He says. This is symbolically expressed by mystics, right? People who have those sorts of experiences, or at least claim to. He says when they say that their knowledge of God is the knowledge God has of Himself, it's not their knowledge of God. It's God's knowledge that sort of is operating through them. Let's talk about that a little bit more. He says it's expressed by Paul when he says in 1 Corinthians. That he will know as he is known, namely by God. God never can be object without being at the same time subject. Even a successful prayer is, according to Paul in Romans 8, not possible without God as Spirit praying within us. The same experience expressed in abstract language is the disappearance of the ordinary subject-object scheme in the experience of the ultimate, the unconditional. The act of faith is that which is the source of this act, is present beyond the cleavage of subject and object. I mean, so basically what you have is the usual division between subject and object. And in this particular case, it's, the person of faith, um, and their object of ultimate concern. And what happens, so there's like a division, but in genuine worship or genuine prayer, whatever that is, right, that division is overcome. Those two things come together and they transcend the division, right? And so that's why you can sort of say that whatever knowledge that one has of God is the knowledge God has of oneself, because the division between the subject and object doesn't exist anymore. It's a transcendent occurrence of worship. And again, you don't have to bear down on this so literally. It's rather as it relates to our usage of terms like ultimate and infinite and absolute, these sort of profound philosophical and theological, these profound, religious terms signifying what is of, the most importance to us, the greatest of our longings, the greatest of our aspirations. And if you'll jump down just one last thing into the next paragraph, he says, the more idolatrous faith, the less it is able to overcome the cleavage between subject and object. And this leads to something like existential disappointment, and it even gets worse and worse and worse after that. So like, now we can start distinguishing, because we already talked about like success, and we talked about the nation and that kind of stuff. Part of how it is that we know that a particular faith object, a particular ultimate concern fails, that it's like basically not a good one, that we can call it idolatrous, is not only does it kind of fail to make good on those on the promise of its sort of ultimate fulfillment, but also its ability to overcome the division between subject and object and sort of transcend that division in some sort of communion, some sort of union. Like it can't do that. It can't really do that. And that is another way of saying, perhaps one remains in a state of alienation. That one is always going to be separated, and eventually the chase for success, the giving oneself over to an extreme form of patriotism, that ultimately it will be revealed that the true transcendent experience that one was hoping to have won't happen, and so then enter existential disappointment, crises, whatever. Okay, so I think we're off to a good start. I'll come back and make another video, probably just one more. If I have to, I'd make a short third one, but we'll see how the next one goes. In any case, hope you're well. Keep reading and keep thinking.